In the final hours before the world shifted forever, Diana moved through Paris with a quiet intensity, carrying emotions she had spent years trying to outrun. This narrative explores the delicate emotional landscape that shaped her final chapter, not the end itself, but the quiet, complicated hours that revealed who she was beneath the impossible spotlight. The city glimmered beneath her as evening settled over Paris. It was a warm night, humming with summer's lingering breath, and yet she felt a familiar coolness inside her, the mix of anticipation and unease that followed her everywhere. She walked slowly through the hotel suite, letting her fingertips glide across polished tabletops, floral arrangements, and velvet chairs that made the place feel luxurious but not truly hers. Her life had been filled with beautiful rooms that never fully belonged to her, curated spaces that reflected the expectations placed upon her rather than the person she longed to become. She stepped onto the balcony, breathing in the warm Parisian air. From above, the city seemed almost quiet, softened by distance. Lights flickered like scattered memories, and she wondered whether freedom ever came easily for someone whose life had been shaped inside rigid walls. She had tried to redefine herself, step by step, often stumbling beneath the weight of scrutiny. Yet here, in this shimmering city, she felt a small spark of possibility, as if the streets below were whispering that another kind of life might still be possible. She thought of William and Harry, their voices still echoing faintly from the earlier phone call. William's thoughtful questions, Harry's enthusiastic stories, both boys carrying pieces of her heart out into the world. She worried about them constantly, not because they were fragile, but because they were so deeply feeling. She hoped they would never learn to hide their emotions as she once had been expected to. Their empathy was a gift, and she prayed the world would be kind enough to let it flourish rather than crush it under the weight of expectation. Inside the suite, she paused near the window, watching her reflection flicker between city lights. She looked older than the girl who had once been thrust into royal life, but she also looked stronger. She had survived storms that few could comprehend. Her resilience had become her compass, guiding her toward a version of herself she was still discovering. She was no longer simply a figure on magazine covers or a symbol molded to fit public narrative. She was a woman learning piece by piece to reclaim her own story and to stand inside it without apology. Memories of her humanitarian work drifted through her mind. Hospital corridors where she knelt beside patients, shelters where she listened to mothers share their fears, distant countries where she held the hands of those who felt invisible to the world. These were the moments that grounded her, moments where she felt closest to the truth of who she was. She carried those faces with her tonight, reminders that compassion always mattered more than ceremony, and that real dignity was found in how gently one held the suffering of others. She moved to the small table, where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light. An open notebook waited there, its pages half filled with fragments of thought. She did not write confessions or revelations meant for the world. Instead, she wrote quiet sentences about courage, kindness, and the strange loneliness that followed people who lived under constant scrutiny. She wrote of her sons, of the way William's eyes sometimes looked older than his years, of how Harry's laughter could still cut through the heaviest of days. She wrote about learning to forgive herself for staying silent too long and for speaking out imperfectly when she finally found her voice. The pen moved slowly, but steadily, each line a small act of self-acceptance. She acknowledged the young woman she had been, hopeful, uncertain, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the life she married into. She acknowledged the older woman she had become, more sure of her values, more aware of her limits, more determined to live according to her heart rather than everyone else's script. She did not pretend she had always known what she was doing. She simply admitted on the page that she had tried and that trying had to count for something. Later, she rose and crossed the room again, drawn back to the balcony by the soft glow of the city. Cars moved like tiny beads of light along the avenues. Somewhere below, people were laughing over dinners, hailing taxis, falling in love, arguing over nothing and everything. Life went on in 1,000 directions at once, indifferent to titles and headlines. For a fleeting moment, she imagined herself disappearing into that anonymity, just another woman in a city that did not know her name. The thought was bittersweet. There was a part of her that cherished the ability to use her platform to bring attention to the voiceless. Yet there was another part, quieter but persistent, that longed for a life measured not in photographs and newspaper columns, but in unrecorded mornings, in private jokes, in days that passed without anyone demanding a statement or a pose. She knew she could not fully have that life, but the longing itself reminded her that she was still at her core. She returned inside and sank onto the edge of the bed. The room hummed softly with the muted sounds of the city and the faint buzz of distant traffic. She smoothed the blanket absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting toward the future. She wondered what shape it might take for her sons. Would they be allowed to define themselves, or would they be pressed into roles that left little room for their truest selves? She hoped that whatever paths they chose, they would carry with them the understanding that worth was not determined by rank or approval, but by the sincerity of one's heart. Her mind wandered back to memories of simpler days with them, chasing them through gardens, giggling over spilled ice cream, sneaking them out for fast food and amusement parks. Those were the moments when she felt most like herself, not as a princess, but as a mother. She wished she had been able to create more of those days, more pockets of ordinary time untouched by cameras or protocol. Still, she cherished every one they had shared, storing them like small, radiant treasures. As the night edged forward, she felt a familiar tension settle over her shoulders, the kind that came when schedules and security details began to tighten around her movements. Plans had been made, routes chosen, times discussed. She understood the necessity of it all, yet she could not help feeling that her life had become an intricate pattern of corridors and doors decided by others. Tonight, more than ever, she wanted to move in a direction that felt like her own, even if only in spirit. She stood once more, crossing to the mirror near the wardrobe. The woman looking back at her wore the signs of a life lived very much in public. Faint lines of worry near the eyes, traces of tiredness softened by determination. But there was also a softness there, a tenderness that had refused to harden despite everything. She adjusted a stray strand of hair and studied herself with a mixture of critique and compassion. She knew the world had painted her as fragile at times, dramatic at others, saintly or reckless depending on the day. She also knew that, in truth, she was none of those single stories and all of them combined. Taking a deep breath, she whispered words she had never quite said aloud before. "I am allowed to be imperfect." The room did not answer, but something inside her seemed to loosen just a little. She felt for a brief moment less like an image and more like a person who had navigated a difficult life with the tools she had, doing the best she could in circumstances few truly understood. As she gathered her things, she glanced once more at the notebook on the table. The pages were messy, the handwriting occasionally rushed, but the words were hers. Not scripted, not approved, not polished by advisors, simply hers. She hoped that, in some way, that same sense of ownership would one day belong to her sons. She wanted them to speak in their own voices, to tell their own stories, to know that they were allowed to question, to feel, to choose. Stepping into the hallway again, she felt the coolness of the air contrast with the warmth of the room she was leaving behind. She straightened her shoulders not out of habit, but out of choice. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she had grown into someone who could meet it with open eyes. She was no longer running from herself. She was, at last, trying to walk toward the life she believed in, even within the limits imposed upon her. Outside, the night waited, vast and indifferent. The city glowed, the streets murmured, and somewhere far away, two boys slept beneath a different sky, unaware of the thoughts that had filled their mother's mind in these final quiet hours. She carried them with her as she moved forward. Every laugh, every tear, every whispered goodnight, they were her constant north, the unchanging point by which she measured every decision, every risk, every fragile hope. Yet even as she reminded herself of this, doubts flickered at the edges of her thoughts. She wondered whether history would ever see her clearly, or whether she would forever be frozen in familiar images. The shy bride, the glamorous icon, the grieving visitor at hospital bedsides. There were so many versions of her in the public imagination, each one built from fragments, none of them whole. She had spent years trying to reconcile those images with the quieter self who existed in unguarded moments. The one who hummed softly in the shower, who laughed too loudly at silly jokes, who sometimes sat on the floor in her dressing room just to feel grounded. She thought about the cost of visibility, about how every smile could be dissected, every gesture interpreted, even acts of kindness, offered sincerely, were sometimes framed as strategy or rebellion. Over time, that scrutiny could make a person question their own intentions, their own instincts. But tonight, she tried to let go of that noise. She focused instead on the memory of a little boy squeezing her hand during a hospital visit, whispering that he felt less alone because she had come. No analysis could touch that moment. It existed outside commentary, outside spin. It was simply real. That was what she wanted for William and Harry. A life in which real moments mattered more than curated images. She knew they would never have complete anonymity, but she hoped they would find spaces where they could be themselves without performance. She pictured them hiking up muddy hills, laughing with friends who saw past their titles, falling in love with people who cherished them for their quirks rather than their surnames. She wanted them to know that vulnerability was not something to hide, but something that could connect them more deeply to others. The car moved through the Paris streets, headlights sliding across stone facades and closed shop fronts. Inside, the hum of the engine created a gentle white noise that wrapped around her like a cocoon. She watched the city pass by, its late-night pedestrians and glowing cafes, turning into a moving tapestry of ordinary life. She found comfort in that ordinariness. For all the narrative that had been built around her, She was still just one person among millions, each carrying their own worries, their own quiet hopes. She let her thoughts wander to the future she had imagined for herself. Not a fairy tale, but something simpler. She pictured a small house filled with light, perhaps near the sea, where she could wake up and make breakfast, without a schedule dictating her every move. She imagined inviting her sons to visit, cooking for them, talking late into the night about relationships, disappointments, and discoveries. In that imagined future, she was allowed to be flawed and funny and occasionally uncertain. She was allowed to be human without explanation. As the drive continued, she became aware of a curious sense of peace threading its way through her reflections. It was not the peace of everything being resolved, far from it. It was the quieter peace of having chosen, again and again, to stand for what she believed in. Compassion over indifference, honesty over pretense, connection over ceremony. She knew she had not always got it right, but she also knew she had tried to use her experience, and even her pain, to shine a light on the suffering of others. In that effort, she felt a sense of integrity that no criticism could entirely erase. She rested her head lightly against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the road beneath the car. Thoughts of William and Harry returned once more, as they always did. She imagined them as grown men, navigating their own complex paths. She hoped they would remember that their mother had loved them fiercely, that she had fought in her own imperfect way to create a world in which they could feel more free than she had. She hoped they would forgive the times she had been distracted or overwhelmed, and understand that underneath it all, her heart had always been turned toward them. The city lights shifted again as the car continued onward, patterns of brightness and shadow playing across the windows. She opened her eyes and watched them, feeling strangely aware of how every journey, no matter how small, was made up of countless, unnoticed moments. A turn here, a pause there, a street crossed, a light changing from red to green. Lives were made in the same way, in quiet decisions, in words spoken or left unsaid, in the gentle accumulation of days. In these last hours of her Paris night, she did not know what history would say about her. She did not know which photographs would become iconic, which quotes would be replayed, which stories would be told and retold. But she knew what she wanted the people who truly mattered to remember. She wanted them to know she had tried to live with empathy in a world that often rewarded detachment. She had tried to keep her heart open, even when it hurt. She had tried again and again to choose love over fear. And so she sat there, carried forward through the sleeping city, holding that intention quietly within her. It was not a dramatic gesture, not a grand proclamation. It was a simple, steady promise to herself that no matter how others defined her, she would keep reaching for the humanity in herself and in everyone she met. In that quiet promise, she felt a different kind of escape, not from her life, but from the narrow definitions others had placed upon it. For the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.